Hello, welcome back to my studio. Today we're going to be talking about color theory for absolute beginners, as well as the fundamentals of brush techniques. It seems pretty simple, but there's actually quite a bit of ground to cover. Color theory to someone who has literally never picked up a paintbrush is going to sound way intimidating. Theory, right? Like this is painting 101. Basically, it just means understanding how colors interact. If there's something to dive deep on in the very beginning, it is color, because that's how you navigate everything. If you want your paintings to look lush and colorful instead of sort of chalky and muted and dull, understanding the basic interaction of colors right out of the gate is going to be vitally important. Before we get into our color wheel though, I want to talk about 3 color vocabulary words that are really important to know. The one that you probably already are familiar with is hue. Hue is just the name of the color. We're just going to use red, orange, yellow, green, blue, violet. You can even get into the world of what I call like Crayola color names, so like macaroni and cheese or dandelion or cornflower blue. I would encourage you to walk that desire in. Learning how to mix color and see and think like a painter is actually the skill of sort of divorcing yourself from having all those color words and just using the basic colors and using the other 2 terms we're going to learn in just a second. So we have the name of the color. The next term we have is value. That's basically how light or how dark a color is. White is like 1 on the value scale and 10 is your blackest black. And then obviously we have stair steps of color all the way in between. And then finally, the last term is saturation or chroma. Those I will use pretty interchangeably. They have slightly different definitions, but for all intents and purposes in this video, it just means how bright something is, how saturated. The reason I have this colored globe is because color is 3-dimensional. A color wheel is 2-dimensional. Basically, you're gonna have your hue on the outside perimeter, and it's also gonna be your highest chroma, your most intense, purest color. And as we move inner in the wheel, we can see that our color becomes less saturated. It becomes lower in intensity and more muted, closer to a neutral. So if you're asking yourself, well, where is brown and gray in this equation? They're going to be closer to the center of the color wheel, just like it's closer to the center of this color wheel. And of course, the color globe not only has our chroma on the center equator line, it becomes less saturated as we work towards the core of the globe, but we can also see with our 2 poles that we have lighter value here and darker value here. And the reason I think a colored globe is a really good visual representation of color is because as we look at our object, we have to navigate all 3 of these terms. The first question we ask ourselves is, what's the hue? To the best of our ability, is this red-orange? Is this blue-green? Then we ask ourselves, how light or how dark is that color? Finally, we ask ourselves, is this intense and bright and highly saturated, like the perimeter of our color wheel? Or is it a more muted color towards the center of our color wheel? And it's after asking ourselves those 3 questions that we can then mix up the right color. We put together this palette in the last video. This is part 2 of a 3-part series. So if you want to see how I put that together, go to the last video where I talk about materials. I'm just going to trace a circle. I'm just using my tape and a pencil. We're going to use this as our outline for our color wheel. And then we're going to do a couple of other little exercises at the bottom. And I know you might be asking, why are we making our own color wheel if ready-made color wheels exist out in the world? These colors all came out of a printer. And this is great for understanding color in theory, but we need to understand how our specific colors work and how they specifically interact with each other. And this is by far the best way to do that. We can use this as a guide, but I definitely don't think you need this. That's why I didn't include it in the materials list. But I also think having this and taping it to your easel or putting it on your desk or wherever you're working is going to be a great little cheat code that you'll use. As simple as a color wheel sounds, when you get kind of into the nuts and bolts and nitty gritty of like mixing all of your own colors, this is going to be way more helpful than you know. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to mark out thirds, because in theory our primaries are going to exist at these thirds of our color wheel, because primaries are not only defined as colors that cannot be mixed by other colors, but they're also equally spaced in the color wheel. So I have quinacridone magenta, which is I think pretty close to a true magenta. We can practice cleaning our brush. So you just want to mix it on the bottom of your jar, press your brush against the edge, and then wipe it with a clean-ish rag and try to get all the color out. And then my other primaries are of course going to be yellow and this phthalo blue, which is kind of working as my cyan. The next thing we want to do is add these other two colors. Again, you can just have these 3 primaries plus white and you're good to go. Because I have 2 more on my color wheel, my ultramarine blue and my pyrrole red, I'm going to go ahead and throw those on my color wheel. Before we fill in the rest, I wanted to make a brief note about how to hold your brush, pick up paint and load the brush, and also how to apply the paint. Now, if you already know how to do this, if you're like, listen, I just want to pick it up how I want to pick it up, lay it down how I want to lay it, I'll put a timestamp and we'll just keep talking about color theory. But like I said, this is a video designed for someone who's never picked up a paintbrush. There's really no wrong way to hold a paintbrush, but I want to encourage you to not grip your brush close to the edge. One thing that newer painters tend to do is try to mimic the hand-eye coordination familiarity that they build up with using a pencil or a pen. You don't want to use all of your finger muscles and your hand muscles to paint. So I would encourage you to break the habit of trying to hold it low and hold it further back. I've seen artists hold it all the way back, and if I'm doing a really loose block in, I will do the same thing, but midway up your handle is perfectly fine. The further back you can hold it, the more your body is inclined to use muscles and joints like your wrist and your elbow and your shoulder, and even if you're standing up and painting, like your legs and your core. Why is that important? Why am I now like giving you guys an anatomy lesson? Well, it's important because you have access to straighter lines and more confident looking brush strokes when you use bigger muscle groups. The next thing is, how do we load our brush? You just want to pick it up to the best of your ability, but then you have to sort of shape it. Rarely do I pull straight from my palette and then go straight to my canvas. What you really want to do is find a place on your palette and then wipe out your brush. This sort of pulling, wiping motion like this is going to be something that you utilize a lot. You don't ever want to push with your brush. It's a bad habit. It's going to ruin your brushes. So the idea is that your brush has bristles and it can hold paint within the bristles. The more paint you have in your bristles, the longer of a line and the more paint you can deposit. What I like to do is pull the paint into a pile and then smooth out my brush to get off all the excess paint using quite a bit of pressure, more pressure than you'd think. And then you'll get your brush nice and straight when you do that. Then you take from your pile and pull your paint. You want to have that little bead at the end. Okay, back to the color wheel. The next thing I'm going to show you is how to mix a color on your palette. So I'm going to show you guys how you can basically mix a red from your cadmium yellow light and your magenta, in case there's some of you who don't trust me when I say that red can be mixed from these 2 primaries. I know I have some doubters out there, and I respect it. I respect the curiosity. So I'm going to show you, while you probably can't get something this saturated, you can almost certainly get a slightly less saturated version of this color. So it'll exist more in here, but let me show you. So back to the mixing, because this is our first time we're going to mix our colors together. I'm going to take a little bit of this yellow, put it right here, and then I'm going to take a little bit of my magenta, just loading it on the corner of my brush. And then the mixing is just kind of this back and forth motion. So I go back and forth and back and forth. And what it looks like in my hand is this sort of twisting motion. Obviously this is too yellow, so I'm going to add more magenta. Here I'm going to put what feels pretty close to this red. It is a little less saturated, but you can see from my magenta and my yellow, you can mix kind of what feels like a true red. And so by definition, sort of what looks like this like true standard red is actually some mix of 2 primaries, and therefore is not a primary itself. My working theory is we don't want to give a color like magenta, which is effectively a pink, the status of being a primary, but that's just my own speculation. Sound off in the comments. I'm going to show you that again with the ultramarine. I'm going to be able to mix basically this color. It'll be less saturated, but I'm going to be able to mix this hue with these 2 primaries. So I'm going to take some of this phthalo and a little bit of this magenta and mix it over here. I'm going to put it right here. We can see maybe not quite as close as these 2, but let's add some white to it. Sometimes when you have a color that's really dark or has a really deep value, you have to add white in order to see it a little bit better. Something like that. It's probably more in here than anything, but still pretty cool, right? So the next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna mix our secondaries, which is gonna be a color to the best of our ability, halfway in between our two primaries. So let's go ahead and start with orange. I'm gonna mix my red, my true pyrrole red, and my yellow, because I really want high chroma, and I think that's how I'm gonna get it. All of the colors on the perimeter are the hues, and they're the highest chroma version of the hues. So one of the things that happens whenever you use the sort of standard yellow, red, blue color palette is usually the problem with that palette is really exposed when you try to mix your violet, because the opposite of violet is yellow. The red that we're mixing in actually has some yellow in it. Instead of getting this lovely violet and red violet that you see over here on the color wheel, it's only going to be kind of in this more low saturation part of the color wheel. We'll explore that a little bit more in a moment. In order to get my violet, I am going to mix ultramarine blue, which is this guy, with magenta. We can see that this color shows up, but it is a little dark, so I'm going to tint it with white just so we can see it better. I'm getting paint all over me. What did I expect? And the next and final secondary is, of course, green. So I'm gonna mix yellow with our cyan to get this really bright, beautiful green. And you want it to look like it's halfway between these colors, but because each pigment is different, you don't want to literally measure out 50% yellow, 50% cyan. You want it to visually look like it's halfway between the two. That's why I always steer students away from color recipes, because students will be like, well, how much yellow was that? Or how much magenta was that? I think it's good for a student to hone their ability to say, yes, that green looks like it's halfway, not composed of half, but halfway between these two on the color wheel. Okay, now let's look at our tertiary colors, aka the colors that we get by mixing a primary and a secondary. While we still have this color wet, let's just mix more yellow into it and get a nice yellowy green. And remember, when we're saying the name of our hue of our tertiaries, it's primary first, secondary second. So this, oh no! It also helps if you actually look at your color wheel and don't just jump into it. And then we're gonna go ahead and do this blue-green color. I'll cover all of that mistake up. Now, if you didn't feel the need to put these other colors on your palette, you're gonna have lots of great space in between here. I have these on here, it's fine, I'm just gonna work around it. In fact, what I might do first is lay down a little bit of white here, because if I'm spacing it correctly, this is where it would be if it was halfway between these two. Okay, so I'm gonna find a yellow orange. So I'm gonna take my cadmium yellow and mix a tiny bit of my pyrrole red into it. You could call this high chroma, yellow orange. So you can stop here. For the sake of this video, I'm going to, I think, mix some in-between colors just to show that a color wheel isn't just an arbitrary dot of all of these colors, but that these colors sort of blend into one another. You know, one thing that used to confuse me as a kid is like, where was brown in the rainbow? Or like, where is gray in all of these colors? So I'm just gonna continue this to show you that all of these colors are related. All right, so the next thing I'm gonna do, I'm gonna label it while it's all fresh in my mind. I'm gonna circle them just because I want to know that these are all the paints that I have in tubes. In fact, I'm just gonna go a little above and beyond and make myself a paint tube. Admittedly, this is a little extra, but you know, this is why I'm an artist. And then everything else, I know that I've mixed to get to those colors. I'm gonna go ahead and label my secondaries. And then I'm gonna do my tertiaries. Red is tough because I would probably consider my true primary to be right here. I think quinacridone magenta is ever so slightly cool than a true magenta, at least true to like a printer magenta, which is going to be, it's like perfectly calibrated magenta. So this might seem a little confusing, but basically I would just acknowledge that my primary probably lives right there, halfway between red and quinacridone magenta. So now that our color wheel is completed and labeled, now we can move on to understanding what I would consider maybe the most important aspect of color theory, and that is complements. We've proven in this exercise that you can mix all of these beautiful high chroma, high saturation colors, right? We can work our way all the way around the color wheel with our own paints. How magical. However, as we know, the color wheel is two-dimensional and color is three-dimensional. So if we look at the color cube, we know that, okay, if you add white, you can get to this part of the color globe. If you were to add black, you could get to this part of the color globe. But what about all these colors in the center of our color globe? How are we going to mix those? And the answer is you have to understand every color's complement. So I'm sure you've heard the phrase complementary color, or these two colors are complements. I used to think that it meant that the colors like looked really good together, but it actually has to do with completing the other color. They complete each other. Basically what it means is if you take two colors that are directly opposite each other on a color wheel, that color would eventually achieve what's called chromatic gray, which is gray, but gray made with combining colors, as opposed to a gray made from mixing black and white. So in theory, if you mix any of these, it would get to gray. In actuality, it's just going to give you a very low intensity version of the color. For all intents and purposes, all you need to know is that the color opposite of every color on the color wheel pretty much cancels the other color out. And that's why this tool, having the color wheel nearby while you're mixing colors, is helpful, because let's say you're looking at your apple and you want to mix a peachy yellow color. Well, a peachy yellow color that lives truly on this apple isn't going to live in here. It's going to live somewhere down here because it's not quite as saturated as this. So how do we get this to be less saturated? If we add more red, it'll just pull it this way. If we add more green, it'll just pull it this way. So you have to look opposite the color wheel to find the color that's going to keep it this color but make it more muted. Okay, I'm going to take my crusty straight edge, I use this in painting if you can't tell, and I'm going to give myself 3 rectangles. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take 2 colors opposite each other on the color wheel. I'm going to start out with my orange and phthalo blue color combination. So I'm going to start by mixing an orange that's as close to this as I can mix. And I'm going to mix a generous pile because I'm going to pull from it for more than just the one blob. Again, using our mixing technique, smooshing out the paint. So I'm going to put this right here. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take another brush and I'm going to put phthalo blue down here. I'm going to take a tiny little dot of phthalo blue. A little goes a long way. You'll eventually learn kind of each color's personality. So we can see by just mixing a tiny little dab of phthalo blue, this color went from bright screaming traffic cone orange to all of a sudden an orange that might actually exist in the natural world. And we did that, it's still orange, right? By mixing its complement. So when I told you adding red to it will just make it red-orange and adding yellow will just make it more yellowy. In order to get this, we had to find its complement and mix it in. So it's still orange, it's just muted. I'm gonna take a little more phthalo. You can see now we're getting into brown territory. Brown for me always exists right here in the middle of the color wheel or in the color globe, and it's just warm and neutral, right? Warm and neutral this way, it might look more like a khaki brown. Warm and neutral this way, it's gonna be like a rich brown. Warm and neutral this way, it's gonna be more of like a true brown. If you're wondering on all this, okay, these colors are great, but how do you get brown? Well, here you go. You can see these are both brown, but this one starts to feel more cool. I'm gonna take my blue brush. You may have to switch brushes at this point and mix more blue in with it. Okay. So we can see here, we have 2 high chromas and then some variation in the middle. Clean your brush, clean your brush. Okay, now let's do yellow and it looks like it is a blue violet and see what we get. And then I'm going to use my other brush and I'm gonna mix a blue violet in this neighborhood. So I'm gonna do ultramarine blue and a little bit of quinacridone magenta. That actually feels pretty gray, which is nice. And finally, we're gonna do red and green. I'm gonna find what's opposite of my pyrrole red, which is sort of a phthalo green, blue-green kind of color. And then just one more, I'm gonna go ahead and mix quinacridone magenta with more of a yellowy green. I would encourage you to do something similar and to mix as many of these complements as you can. The more kind of research you can do on this exercise, the better. And the last thing I'll say on this is probably my best advice that I give painters who want to get good at painting color. And that is, if you want to be good at knowing how to use, manage, navigate really bright, beautiful colors and a good sense of light and color harmony, mix your own neutrals. Until you get a pretty good sense of how to mix your own neutrals, don't buy those neutrals yet. Put them away for a little bit. Get used to a high chroma palette if you can, even if your plan in the future is to kind of live in this neutral world. Okay, so at this point in our color exploration, we now know how to mix the equator line, or this middle line of our color globe where we have these bright, full chroma, high saturation colors. We also know how to mix towards the center of our color globe by mixing a complement to pull our color somewhere in the middle. We know how to mix these high chroma, these earthy colors, and this leaves us with the value scale once again. We have white on our palette, and I know you might be thinking, well, why don't you have black on your palette? It's a good question. On one hand, it's a rule. It's like an art school rule, but I would never include a rule in here that's just a rule. I have to know why it's a rule. So white we can take, and let's say we add it to a green. Let's take some yellow and a little bit of phthalo blue, and we're gonna end up with this nice light white tinted green color. Let's put them over here. You know, we add even more white to it. We can add it over here. Why don't we do the same thing with purple, with magenta? Let's do ultramarine blue. We'll mix a little bit of white. We can just keep adding white until we get to basically white that's just like ever so slightly purple. So we know we can go that way with our value using white. Another tip is you can also move up the value scale to lighter colors using yellow. So if I wanted to take a red and make it lighter, I could add yellow. It would make it more orange, so we'd have to know if that's the direction we want to go, but we have white and yellow as a way to navigate up the value scale, to become lighter in value, to get to this side of our color globe. But what about this side? You can have black on your palette, but I find that a way to get to richer dark colors is by using some of the already dark pigments on our palette. And the thing is, you don't need as much variation within your dark colors as you do your light colors. As we can see, sometimes we need white in order to even see the hue of the color within the darker pigments. That's why the purple and purple violet and blue violet, we sort of had to add white because those pigments were so dark that it was hard for us to see. And that's the case. Humans really struggle to see sort of the color variation within dark. Within this palette, you do already have access to a lot of colors that are dark. To humor everyone, I will go ahead and mix as close to a black as I can mix. So I'm going to start with my dark pigments. Let's start with phthalo blue, quinacridone magenta, maybe some of our red. It's kind of hard to see what color we even have right now. We'll add a little bit of ultramarine blue to it. To me, this feels very purple, so I'm going to add a little bit of yellow right here. And it's hard to tell. Again, we can't really distinguish what hue it is exactly until we put a little bit of white into it. It's like shining light on it. Yeah, it's like a dark, dark, dark purple. So I'm gonna go ahead and add a tiny bit of yellow. It'll pull it back to more of a gray. We'll keep adding. Remember, white cools it down a little, so I may have to match my white with a tiny bit of yellow to warm it back up. And I will say, like, I'm able to mix a gray, you know, instinctually, just because I've practiced this a lot. Eventually, if you practice enough, you'll get there too. This is my lightest gray. But you can see, you can get all of those colors even within this. So basically, the short answer is you can mix your own blacks. So here we are, in theory, all of these colors you can get black, you can get a really good, nice gray color that feels incredibly neutral. You can mix all of these high chroma colors. You have all of these neutrals. It really is a pretty extensive palette. Hopefully you're convinced by this point that you don't need a lot of colors to be able to mix a lot of colors. And in fact, by kind of limiting yourself, you're gonna really push yourself to have the same sort of knowledge base that I've cultivated. It might seem hard, but there's nothing more valuable than investing in this aspect of painting. The drawing can come later, the composition can come later, but if you have a good understanding of color, you have an understanding, in my opinion, of what makes painting so great. But I'm a colorist, and hopefully if you're here, it's because you love color too. So that is everything for this video. If you have been able to mix this, whether it took you 1, 2, 3 attempts, that's amazing. Congratulations. You have come a long way. This is a lot of knowledge to understand and have under your belt. In the next video, we're gonna put all of this to use. I'm gonna have this little worksheet next to me. It's really helpful as we jump into our next paintings and tackle our subject matter and finally make like a real painting.